Hello and welcome to the ABC Music Talk podcast, the show for anyone interested in the music industry. This week, my guest is an absolute indie legend, and when I saw his thought leadership piece in Music Week on how artist marketing can unite the industry, I knew he would be a great voice of reason to add to my ever-growing list of incredible guests. We had a chat and came up with a theme for this show called Pick Your Team, as the piece he wrote was all about the people that make this industry tick. But before we get into all of that, it's time for me to remind you to go rotor your videos. Rotor is for artists, managers, labels, or anyone in the music industry who needs to create video content for promotion or monetization. Rotor makes it fast, easy, and inexpensive to do all of that in one place. Head to www.abcmusic.co and click the Rotor logo on the homepage to access a 10% off discount for the service. Welcome to the show, CEO and founder of Cartel Music Group, Charles Kirby-Welch.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. And thank you for coming to the Halley, the new co-working space in East London, who have very kindly lent me one of their recording studios. So listeners, you are graced with a nice dead room again. I've just realized that Charles is now looking slightly crestfallen because he thought this might actually be my recording studio. We're all good. Okay, we're going to elaborate on the piece you wrote for Music Week in a bit. But as I just sort of mentioned, as we were talking about this as a sort of prep for the show, I remembered that there was a book that I read when I was learning about the music industry called Everything You Need to Know About the Music Business by Donald S. Passman, and the very first chapter was called Pick Your Team, and it just felt like a really good title for this show. But first, all of my guests, they have to tell me their backstory. So we need to learn, how did you become what you are today?
Yeah, okay, well, I'll give you a small potted version of that. So I got into music in the 90s through dance music culture, rave culture, and that kind of led me to DJing, which was probably the only careers advice I listened to, and moved from Yorkshire to London to kind of get closer to the action, as it were. Went to university and ended up DJing more and getting into the music industry, which I really had no knowledge of prior to that. And I kind of fell into an internship at Virgin Records at the end of the 90s, working in the dance department. Great team, and just learning about what major record labels were all about. The more time I spent there, the more it didn't make sense to me. And eventually I left and went to work in a record shop and started a management company. And the management company was Cartel. And that was sort of early noughties. And, to cut a long story short, management progressively turned into recorded music servicing of artists that we were managing, artists that either wouldn't do a record deal, couldn't find a record deal, couldn't find the right people to do a record deal with, and decided that they could do it themselves, whether that was putting out a white label or putting out a full record. So yeah, the rest is kind of history. I just got more and more into the world of independent distribution, independent marketing of records, but always with a backdrop of not wanting to have a record label, which might seem at odds with most people who get into that sort of environment. But having come out of a label environment and seeing it not work for the artists, particularly the niche artists at Virgin, that was the thing that I think really kind of resonated with me. Virgin's always had a great roster of underground talent, and they didn't always fit there from my perspective. So yeah, coming at it from an artist industry mindset, which is the mindset of a manager ultimately, but getting into the recorded music space at a time when DIY distribution was just starting to really explode. So you had iTunes launching, you had many an independent distributor aggregator starting to scale at that point. So we kind of...
So what year was this?
So this would have been 2003, 4, 5.
Yeah, right.
With iTunes launching and sort of the digital music economy starting to actually accelerate. Yeah, that was the beginning. Yeah, and nearly 20 years later, that's really what we do, and it's evolved massively in that time, as you well know. But it's been an interesting journey.
Okay, so it's interesting. I mean, sounds like we had similar sort of starts. I started in dance music at a major record label,
Right?
Yeah, and sort of worked my way into the indie world very quickly from there. That's very cool. Thank you for that. Okay, so the article itself was an attempt at demonstrating how important the expert human touch to marketing is required to get the most out of a record release. Mm-hmm. In fact, you talk about how just working a record isn't the right approach. So can you give, just for the listeners' benefit who perhaps haven't seen it, and I will put a link to it in the show notes, just to kind of just flesh out kind of more about what you were kind of getting at there with the article?
Yeah, I mean, it comes from a day-to-day reflection that we have in what we do as you know, Cartel is principally a artist label services business that is centered around a distribution baseline. So we distribute music digitally and physically and help the artists navigate and manage that part of their business. So what a record label kind of does or did and continues to do in different spaces. And as we do that activity, and progressively, I think in the last 10 years, the promotional and marketing work is often not exclusively centered around selling records. Obviously, with streaming evolving over the last decade, particularly, the focus has moved from how many units can we sell week one to how engaged can our audience be. And as you start to shift that, you're starting to think about, you know, developing an artist audience, which is an investment in the artist business, you know, universally, holistically, as much as it's an investment in that individual record campaign. I think the challenge for companies like us and record labels and people who are solely engaged in the recorded music business is that you're only participating in one area. And there've been all kinds of experiments in extrapolating that into 360 areas, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But the objective and the end game of that activity is really to help build the artist business as a whole. So what I was trying to get at is just to raise that as a talking point and make it more central than it often is when you're doing a record deal or an indie distribution style of a record deal, because for everything from finance to human resource to the technology that you can deploy in kind of executing those goals needs to look at the holistic goal, not just the outcome of streaming a track or selling a record.
When we talked about this afterwards, it felt like really what you were also getting at was you're explaining the fact that all of these different parts are really important, but really it was kind of almost a way of trying to get people to think of how do you pick your team, right? How do you approach this process of putting a record out? Because as you say, it's not just about putting that record out, because it's not just about putting it on the shelves and hoping it sells. It's now it's a longer game, right? And often, you know, these artist careers are the thing that really you should be focusing on rather than each individual record.
Absolutely. I think, you know, the album is never going to go away, thankfully, but it doesn't suit every situation and every artist in every moment. I think, you know, there can be chapters of an artist's career that take them through different sort of dimensions of how they might release recorded music. But the fact is that most consumers are consuming tracks at a high frequency and really want to eat as much as they can. So if you're supplying that kind of ecosystem, you need to be mindful of the environment you're working within. It's very much like a social media environment. So I think, you know, we have to pivot and think about what that means in an artist business, and it doesn't mean the same for every artist. So there's nuance and objectivity that needs to come into focus in each campaign. And the central figure for us increasingly or often is the manager. He has or she has the day-to-day voice and responsibility for, you know, projecting on behalf of the artist, like what the goal is, what are we trying to achieve here, why are we doing this, how much should we invest in this activity versus that activity. And that's a huge responsibility that wasn't traditionally carried necessarily by the manager. And one of the things I'm trying to get at is for an artist to be its own record label, which is something that's, you know, being offered to artists, you know, through hard advertising across to sort of narrative and just sort of, you know, industry pundits kind of explaining what options are out there. The artists, you know, must kind of step up and take responsibility for their overall businesses and engage in that process and not be reliant on third parties to take that responsibility. So they need to put a team in place who can help them deliver on that. It's a real challenge because it isn't necessarily just your manager or just your manager and your distributor. There's actually many component parts depending on what you want to achieve, and how far and wide you want to kind of spread your music and grow your audience. Is it global or is it very local? Are you just starting out, or are you already a kind of recognized global name?
And presumably, I mean, you mentioned about how central the role of the manager is in an increasing way. I guess the set of skills that the manager has to now have, and that's coming from your experience, presumably, is where sort of the genesis of Cartel came from, which you explained was originally a management company. I mean, I like you just pointed out, that's what I've seen, where some of the gatekeepers of things like distribution have become a little bit more commoditized, they're a lot more available. The idea of getting into a shop is now not what it used to be. When I first had my vinyl label, I would go to a distributor and kind of plead for them to take on my record so that they could try and get it into a record shop. And always that problem was, why is somebody going to come into that shop and buy the record? And of course, that sort of thing has changed, because you can now have access and a dialogue with the audience in a way that you just couldn't really do before. Certainly not on a global scale like we have.
No.
What's been interesting for me is on this theme is that in places like Southeast Asia, which I have some experience in, a lot of the times the record companies also perform a sort of management function as well. So they've sort of done it the other way around, so to speak. It seems to be that general sort of move towards the fact that these artists are supposed to be creative people. They're not supposed to be necessarily adept at handling their own promotion and marketing and all the other things that they are sort of almost expected to do now. It's not necessarily a natural thing. So picking your team, getting the right amount of people around you is incredibly difficult. And presumably you've molded Cartel around this sort of holistic kind of approach to what does each individual artist need? And presumably you've tried to, and when I look at your website, you've got a whole range of services, and you obviously looking at that as like, well, maybe they need this, this, and this, but not this. Is that correct? Is that kind of how you?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I'm often at pains to try to not describe us as a distributor, and to make a point of difference between what we do, the approach we take.
Well, it's not cool anymore to be a distributor.
No, I mean, yes, arguably, they provide a very, very necessary function, of course, and particularly in the digital space, but not exclusively. Physical is still very important for a lot of artists. Yeah, the scalability of distribution has provided real choice and options within the marketplace, and that's a positive thing. But you can't scale human engagement and team, that can't be done through an algorithm. The humans can work with the algorithms and help your music perform better. So we've tried to position ourselves as a boutique and as a more, a smaller company with a smaller roster that has the ability to be a little bit more hands-on. The challenge there is, you're looked like for like some of the scale aggregation distribution businesses, and it's an unrealistic comparison. And we're in an industry that is still leaning back on sort of habitual cognizance of what a record deal is. So a distribution contract is still negotiated a little bit like it's a record contract, and people still perceive whoever's providing an advance, whether it's a distribution advance or a recording advance, to be taking some kind of risk and equity in the project. And those things aren't really talked about or defined particularly well, I think, at the moment, in terms of when we enter the DIY space and an artist is choosing to retain control, retain ownership, have the freedom that distribution allows, but doesn't want to take financial responsibility for that. That's slightly juxtaposed, and we need to be very realistic about how that's managed and how the artist and their team perceive it from a business standpoint, and then how they engage the necessary people to work on their record, which is going to be a cost for them ultimately. So I think there's a lot to get into within that for an artist setting up a record label or trying to release music independently at scale. It can be very unwieldy and challenging for their manager potentially, and for them as well, which brings you back to the team aspect.
Yeah.
To come back to your kind of question a bit in terms of like how have we molded the business? We have a distribution pipeline, and we have a network, physical and digital, of being able to sell and distribute records. So that is central to what we do, because we have to be able to sell the music. But the business is split in two, in the sense that One side is that distribution component, and the other side is a campaign management, promotions and marketing component. And that takes more of an agency representation. That side of the business can be engaged independently of the distribution, and is by other labels and distributors and artists. But it formed and developed because of a need, and because of needing to find a balance with the cost of putting those types of promotional services and resource in place, and how affordable that was for some of our clients, or how it wasn't always affordable for some of our clients. So because we have some level of economy of scale, we were able to build a team that was potentially more affordable for them, or more adaptable to their needs, because we were sort of within the silo of what they were doing. So we've molded the company to try and react to the needs of the campaigns and the needs of the artists, which brought me to the Music Week piece, and this mindset of a lot of what we talk about is the audience narrative, the streaming narrative, the creative that supports the music. So you make the music, and maybe you make the music video, and you have the vision of that ultimate origination of the art form. But then supplementary to that, you need all the assets that go within a campaign, whether they're banners or Triller clips or whatever it might be. All of this has to be created and understood in a way that it will excite and engage an audience, create the right perception with the gatekeepers at DSPs. And there's many facets of kind of supplementary creation that you need to set up to really execute a campaign that, once you get into week of release, will move at lightning speed, and you won't have time to think about these things after the fact. And that's how we've tried to mold the business to be able to support the artist and their team, typically management, to be able to deliver on those things in real time and in a way that is affordable for independents, which is probably easier said than done ultimately, but that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, okay. So it feels like you kind of sit in this sort of middle section. So on the one hand, you've got DIY, true DIY distribution, which is nothing more than a website that anyone can kind of log into, upload their music, and often these days pick a few services from a menu, click a few buttons, and they've got a bit of mastering, they've got a bit of publishing, they've got a bit of naming rights administration, they've got a bit of marketing that is in excess of what they're already doing. And then on the other end, you've got kind of the major record companies that will and large indies that are very good at just going, we will just take care of everything. Here's the team, meet the team, and here's some money, and we'll spend that for you, and off we go. And the artist is in the studio, and they are doing the video shoots, and they're doing the photo shoots and doing the meet and greets, and that's therefore the very sort of traditional, I suppose, approach to doing it. I guess what you're talking about is where the manager, and therefore likely the artist, is actively very involved in what's going on, and they form part of your team, if you like, or you form part of their team. It's probably a better way of putting that.
No, indeed, yeah.
And so I'm curious about how do you whatever we do here, it always costs some money, right? Whether that's the cost of people's time, or whether it's the the ads that you're buying on YouTube. How do you handle, if you're not the label, how do you handle the kind of the business side of recoupment and return on investment and all the rest of it? I mean, do you kind of split the advance with the management, or do you just put it up yourself, or do they always have to provide it themselves? How are things paid for?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably how I spend a lot of my days navigating this topic. There's as you say, there's a need for some financial resource to execute a campaign. One of the great things that we have today is a benchmark of, you could call it credit worthiness, if you like, or predictability in terms of potential recurring revenue, and that is streaming. It also comes in the form of chart sales history, and you can look at things like ticket sales, and just to establish where does this artist live in a commercial landscape, and that helps you consider what's proportionate in terms of a potential advance. And often how it plays out is the artist and their management have an idea of what they need to deliver the vision, and we look at it, and they come to us and say, well, we'd like to release this on our own label. We definitely need help, but we want to stay independent / DIY. We need this amount of money and a distribution pipeline and a team that can help us execute that. And then we'll look at that and try and risk assess it. And we approach sort of the financial aspect of trying to resource that completely thinking about recoupability within a short time frame. So we're not.
What's a short time frame for you?
So I think the landscape of sort of distribution recoup timescales sits somewhere between 6 months and 3 years. Mm-hmm. For us, in an artist services spectrum, I'd say the average is around 18 months. The ideal is 9 to 12 or 6 to 12, let's say. But it's very case specific, of course. For developing artists, it's far harder to predict the outcome, and therefore it's much riskier to effectively lend or advance marketing resources. And that's where the real challenge comes. And that's why we've built a lot of internal services so that we can actually deploy a team rather than hard cash to try and get some of those same results. It's slightly less risky for us to offer that rather than money. One distinction that I think I would make in terms of how we operate is we very rarely, write a check and give it to management and say, off you go. We just don't believe that that's the best way for us to engage with those clients. I think there's plenty of managers and teams that can absolutely execute in those circumstances, but in our experience, people actually want a bit of guidance. So everything is done through the lens of a spreadsheet and a budget, and we look at phased digital streaming forecasting, we look at physical forecasting, and we try to make sense of a spend versus a revenue stream over time. And the time frame is we have a kind of 3-year P&L mechanic. It's a basic kind of spreadsheet that we just run that through and try and use that as a tool to sit with management and the artist and sense check their objectives with what we think might be realistic. The music industry is rightly a really optimistic business space. I think all arts and creative businesses need that level of optimism. But one of the responsibilities, I think, for some of the players in this DIY independent landscape is to try and bring responsibility in the provision of funding, because it's very easy to spend money promoting music, and we all know that.
Oh, absolutely. It's great fun as well.
It's great fun, yeah, and you can do all kinds of things, but it's not so easy to make it back sometimes. And in the space that we're in, the indie space, slightly left of center, alternative music, it can be challenging. So we spend a lot of time in that area at the beginning of a campaign and beginning of a relationship.
Yeah, okay. And so new artists, or perhaps heritage artists that perhaps only existed in, say, the vinyl world and didn't ever, build social networks and ever put anything new out on a streaming service. I mean, that predictability is a real challenge at that point. I mean, how do you kind of navigate that? It
is. I mean, we've had some great clients and have some great clients in that space where, they have, careers spanning 2 or 3 decades and have reached a point in their career where they're free and independent, and they clearly have an audience, but haven't necessarily engaged in the modern world of streaming and digital. And you get into marketing, and you get into kind of how active are their fan base, how convertible are they to streaming, and in some cases really not very convertible at all. It's still evolving, it's still progressing. I think there's a lot of hope over the next 5-10 years that the more kind of mature genres and mature artists will see increasing conversion to streaming as the older audience migrate to the technology, and that is happening gradually. But hip-hop artists and that genre is obviously still governing. The younger demographic music is still really driving the big numbers on streaming platforms, and this is where physical is so interesting as part of the business today, because it's become far more demand orientated. I mean, even at the beginning of my career, which is sort of late 90s in the music industry, you could still fill the shelves with some hope that people would just buy it because you'd spread it everywhere.
It's a supermarket model.
Yeah, and that's not really in existence too much anymore. So now there has to be demand for you to put a physical product out there. But if you have an audience, no matter how old they are, if you can get them engaged and use some of the amazing kind of e-commerce platforms that are out there today, whether it's Kickstart or Music Glue or Bandcamp or whatever, there are platforms to test your audience, and to with some of the heritage and more established artists that we've worked with, we've recouped month 1 on a campaign because physical has just been the mainstay.
Well, I guess if you execute a really good pre-order campaign.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a shame the Pledge music went the way it did, because that was, as a concept, was fantastic.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it is a shame, and I think hopefully we'll see some kind of rebirth of that type of platform orientated, pre-order driven.
I've started to see a few things around the live space in terms of tickets. So the idea of pre-selling those tickets as either online concerts or actual concerts themselves. I know it's difficult at the moment, but and those companies are then also building in a merch and a physical and a download, and like they're trying to sort of like fill out that revenue stream ecosystem for the artists.
Yeah,
so I think you're right. I think we will see more of that come around.
I think the live space, and it'll be interesting to see how it kind of comes back after what's an incredibly difficult time for it at the moment. But we've worked closely with a number of independent promoters. I mean, DHP I'll mention as one, who've been I think very forward thinking in the way that they look beyond just live ticket sales, and they look at the artist and think about ways of cross marketing the artist and using the live marketing budget to help project and promote the overall artist campaign. And record labels and artists sort of doing DIY recorded music releases, working with the data that the live business has to have a combined offering. That's powerful, and particularly now where that offering it has to be virtual and online. It's a pretty extraordinary moment in that case. But you are seeing opportunities come through that. People are engaging, whether like the Laura Marling example that came up, and the idea that high quality virtual performances can be sold as a premium experience, and that can then perhaps be bundled with whether it's a recording of that performance or merchandise or other things. I think this brings us back to that idea of an artist industry and marketing to that holistic industry, and selling really any type of product, whether it's a stream or a piece of merchandise. But the team that are working with the artist are helping to reach that end game and build a business.
And I mean, obviously a lot of focus of late has been on streaming services and therefore playlisting as a kind of a thing. And I kind of felt like when I was reading your Music Week article that what you were half saying to people that I think have been obsessing over the need to be in certain playlists, New Music Friday or whatever it might be, as almost like their only strategy, like their only kind of goal, like their end goal. But my understanding of all of these platforms, and I interviewed Chaz Jenkins from Chartmetric, for example, so I have a sort of a fairly decent understanding of how some of those internal algorithms work at Spotify in particular. Have you found, like, especially for new artists, and in fact for those heritage artists, sort of going back to that sort of conundrum of like, how do you take something, an artist that perhaps isn't coming straight off one album cycle into the next, where there's sort of that relative predictability around the next output? I mean, how do you seed these artists into this ecosystem that's being built? I mean, are there any tricks and tips that you've got for getting into some of the playlists, or do you take the view that actually the playlists are the bit afterwards? Like, you do all your marketing beforehand, and then you hope that you get the playlisting placements.
I mean, it's such a topical area, the whole notion of how do you navigate from our perspective as a company that sells the service that enables artists to get onto distribution platforms and have a chance of getting onto playlists. So how do we express that to the marketplace? And then from the artist perspective, just how do I get myself onto these playlists? What do I need to do? And I think from the artist perspective, there's no kind of right answer in terms of how do I get onto New Music Friday. There are just simply a limited number of slots.
Would you even aim for New Music Friday?
We do aim for New Music Friday in certain campaigns, but not in all. So, for example, last Friday we released the second album from an artist called Kaiser. People will know from her hit Hideaway many years ago. And, she's at a level where the conversations, she's a very established name. She's had a lot of success on streaming platforms with previous music, and she's in a pop environment. So in terms of just a mass audience consumption, those day of release playlists, New Music Daily, New Music Friday, and the Amazon Deezer, etc. equivalents are, I think, aimed at a very general, broad audience, like the chart is. Okay, so I think conceptually, musically, if you're making popular music, then okay, you can argue that you could fit and not be just skipped immediately.
Right, because it's the skip issue that causes the problem. It can cause the problem. Because it has a downward impact on the algorithms.
Absolutely. So there's just being realistic about, are you going to fit sonically, musically, culturally, and then, commercially, is it realistic that you can compete with, the 70-80% of established names that are repeatedly getting into these playlists? Right. So that's in terms of those. Yes, we aim for them where it feels appropriate and where we want to hit the runway hard week one on streams. But yeah, you've got to manage that. You've got to manage the expectations around that with the artist, because if you're entering that world independently, you're competing with people who probably are investing a lot more money from a major record standpoint into their general visibility and marketing at a global level, and that's very hard to compete with on an independent level. So you've got to have your eyes open, I think, going into that. I think the other side of that coin, in terms of how do you affect streams if you're perhaps not focused on those types of playlists. You're maybe more focused on genre or thematic or niche playlists, which are perhaps just smaller generally in terms of followers and listeners. There are tangible actions that you can take. I mean, on Spotify, which is probably the most visible platform in terms of streams and followers, monthly listeners, and that's obviously a narrative that people bring into this equation a lot. It doesn't mean the platform's more or less important than any other necessarily. You have to think about that in terms of your audience. But because those metrics are public and very visible, you can think about monthly listeners to follower ratios, and you can affect the follower ratio with a digital advertising strategy. And I think particularly in the last 6 months, you're seeing an increasing awareness of a focus shift onto how do I bring my audience into this space? And if I bring my audience into this space, that's a positive, because more people will engage with the music, which could potentially affect the algorithm. And it's like sending someone into HMV or Rough Trade or onto Amazon. Amazon as a physical retailer, are far more kind of ambivalent to your needs as an artist, but it's algorithmically driven. So if you want Amazon to have the right amount of stock on the Saturday after you've released your new album, you really need to think about driving some pre-orders into Amazon, because if they haven't had any pre-orders, they won't have ordered enough records and you will go out of stock. There's different manifestations of where you point your audience and where you generate demand and engagement. And I think that's how you need to kind of think about, whether you're a heritage act or a new artist, developing your career in a way that is not reliant on third-party gatekeepers.
Which kind of goes back to your point about don't just work the record. You've got to look at this in a much sort of more holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so in terms of all the different services that you're offering, I mean, do you sort of quantify things like playlist plugging? I mean, do you sort of talk about that as like a commodity that you can charge for, or is it not really like that? How do you what's your sales pitch?
We only talk about playlist plugging in so much as it's not a service that you can charge for, and not a service that you should pay anyone else for. I don't believe in that as a paid for service at all. Yeah. I think that there is technology like Submit Hub, for example, where you can deliver your music to a number of recipients that might consider placing it editorially in the third-party playlist space. In the official playlist space with DSPs, ultimately we come back to a good actor relationship, well organized, well presented type of campaign concept, right? So we work hard on our relationships with those DSPs. We try and be a good actor with them and make their lives as easy as they can be. You have to just bear in mind the amount of music that they're being delivered. It's unimaginable in terms of how could anyone listen to that much. So to be a good partner with those companies is about sort of making their life easy in receiving what we're trying to promote. And that's really the most important thing that we can do. We can't, and we wouldn't try and force them to sort of play anything. We're just not in that position. I don't think anyone necessarily is in the independent space. So it's about contextualizing it to our potential clients and explaining it, talking it through, and finding an approach that is going to make sense. And often it's you're saying slow down, take more time.
What do you mean you want it out Friday? It's Thursday. What are you doing?
The lead time is important, not least because you're actually putting a piece of music up globally in a moment, and that, if you think about that probably does need to take a little bit of time to do well. It's possible to do it very, very fast, but I think for anyone to have a chance of receiving that piece of music, particularly if you're an unknown entity, and quantify it quickly to in a way that they might think, this sounds interesting, I want to check it out. And I already know before I check it out that it's going to live in a certain lane. It's going to be, it's either chill or it's pop or it's dance or it's aggressive or it's happy or it's sad. And, because algorithms work with tags and humans also, have moods in terms of what they want to listen to at any given time. So the more you can inform the listener or the algorithm about what it is you're sending them, they're then pre-armed and pre-warmed to receive it in a way that could be positive.
Yeah. And
it's amazing to see how often that's missed, because there's so much to think about, in terms of an artist kind of putting music out, that bit probably seems obvious. It's almost obvious if you listen to it what it is, right? But for those of us that are listening to a lot of music as part of our job, well, it would really help
Sure.
if you kind of set it up for me.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably most profound if you're working in a streaming platform.
Definitely, yeah. And so, I mean, this is all sort of echoes of the original Music Week piece, where it's having this expert team around you, because what you're explaining, at least as far as I understand it, is that it isn't just about knowing somebody at Spotify that might be able to get you onto a playlist. It's much more about creating almost like an aura around the artist and the record itself, so that it all travels at the same time. That's a bit of radio, it's a bit of live, it's a bit of social media, it's perhaps influencer strategy that makes sense, that helps with that sort of what you were just talking about there. Of course I know what this is, that it sits within a particular tribe or a particular movement. So as the audience, when they first come to it and they first see it, that they will understand what it is that they're looking at and listening to.
Absolutely. And I think it's what great record labels have done so well historically and still continue to do today, is how do you create excitement? How do you create anticipation for art, for music, for bands? It's hard to do when there's so much noise and traffic. But when you do it, when you get it right, it is unstoppable. And I mean, of course, it comes down to taste as well, and the right people, and how you direct it. But that's really what you need to think about. I mean, we had a session with a DSP recently where we were playing the music of an artist, and they gave us some tips just in terms of what they would like to hear before we did this.
Okay.
And they wanted to hear really about where the music was from, what it was about, what the artist was about, and what their kind of story was. They didn't want to hear about any of the marketing drivers that we might be able to throw at them. We're on this radio, we've got this much digital advertising. They wanted to hear the context around the art, because they're music fans. So they were interested in that. And it's like when you go to a gig and you watch an artist, an amazing gig sticks with you because of the art, ultimately, the performer. And that will stick with you more than the review of the concert you read that you didn't go to, even if it was outstanding. You thought, I wish I'd been to that. But, being at the concert would have been, memorable in a different way. And it's the same kind of impact point that you're trying to create. So, and that's a creative process that I think the artists should lead, particularly in our kind of environment. So they should be engaged in it.
And do you think that they were asking for that because for them, they're trying to curate their shop, if you like, in a way that is going to be very engaging and sticky for the audience that they're intending for it to be? So the fact that you've spent a whole load of money on radio plugging doesn't really impact the aesthetic, if you like, of what including your music in their shop front will actually do to their service. Is that what kind of where you felt that they were going with it?
Absolutely. I think in some dimensions, whether or not you're on the radio or in the press or smashing it on TikTok, has no bearing on whether or not you fit in a certain type of ethereal playlist or a very kind of genre or mood-based playlist. They are building those playlists so that they're highly engaging for the listener and are delivering musically and culturally what the listener wants or what they perceive that to be. And that, I think often has no bearing on the traditional promotional drivers. Though in a way that's an extreme. I think there's a huge middle ground where, yes, your cultural relevance generally is a benchmark for which gets you listened by those people in the first place. So it's not I don't think you can say radio doesn't matter anymore, it's all about playlisting. It's just not as black and white as that. In fact, none of it's black and white. But you do have to consider, and it's positive that there are people gatekeepers, if you like, working in these places that care deeply about their playlist and the listener experience, because that's akin to the independent record shop curator who's got the records under the counter. That's like, oh, I know what you're into. I've got this one for you. It's a similar concept, and it's worked for a long time, just in different parts of the retail landscape.
And I mean, this is a theme that kind of sits across, the whole process of decision making. I mean, if you're an artist and a manager, and you're thinking about who will be my partner, is that a record label? Is that a distribution company? Is that a DIY service? Because when we talked before, there's been a sort of an ongoing, should we call it, maturity in our industry, whereby it's very easy for certain companies to offer half decent distribution network, some money up front, and some low distribution fees. But what you actually get for that is what, right? Yeah, okay, you've got some money, you've got your low distribution fee, and you've got a decent distribution network. But what do you actually get? Do you get anyone to help do exactly what you've just described, which is frame this piece of music in a way that the audience is actually going to understand it? Because if you get, we talked about, certain larger companies who have an incredibly overworked staff of label managers or artist relations people, that there's absolutely no way in the world they can possibly have a passion for every type of music that they are being asked to deal with, or indeed have the time to do it. I mean, that scale thing, you kind of touched on it earlier. Technology scales, of course, but the human beings don't. And so, coming back to our theme of pick your team, I mean, is it just that there's a lot of choice, which is on the one hand bad because it's confusing, but on the other hand it's good because then there's a lot of opportunities to make different decisions. I mean, so when people are coming to you, what do you find that they're asking for? Like, what is the thing? Like, why have they come to you as opposed to, let's just call it, some of the others that are perhaps slightly more in the press all the time?
We're not going to name names.
We are not, because it's unnecessary, but it's a point, right?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, and it's definitely changed over, I think, the last 3 to 5 years. I would say 3 to 5 years ago, it was very typical for people to come in and say, so and so is offering me this on this rate, can you do better? We really like you guys, but really what we want is as much money as we can get from you and as cheap a rate as possible. And that still happens, but it was definitely a baseline of kind of, it was disheartening, I think, to be kind of constantly in that kind of space where, obviously we're a business and we need to charge a fair price for the service that we offer and all of that, and for the human resource that kind of comes into that. And similarly, those scale businesses need to charge an appropriate price for the technology that they can provide. So it's trying not to look at things like for like, but trying to understand the difference in the options that are in front of you. And that, I think, is in the artist services / independent digital aggregation world, where, to kind of reference those bigger companies, they all offer a version of what we offer, and they all kind of offer a version of many things, but they're offering it at different levels to different people. So it's kind of your responsibility, I think, as the artist and the manager, to just understand that, ask the right questions, and figure out what your needs are, and whether actually the best thing for you is as much money as you can get on the cheapest price, or is the best thing for you, having a team of people that can actually help you get it done, and you're probably going to pay more for that. And I think you're starting to see an increasing number of, probably similar sized businesses to us, or kind of more boutique offerings, or splinters from management companies emerging, where, they are offering a slightly more expensive version of digital distribution and campaign management, where effectively you've got someone to talk to. So, like, these days, it's actually really gratifying that we're finding more people coming to us saying, what, we've worked with one of these bigger companies, and we've realized that actually we really need more support in a certain area, and we're looking for that. And can you help us with that? And can you just help us with that? Or do you have to do distribution and help us with that? Like, what does it look like?
And how flexible are you with that? Because that was always, like, one of the companies that I worked for, we almost could never separate the distribution bit, because that was our baseline, that was our business, and anything kind of was literally on top of that. I mean, are you able to separate those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think we're at a tipping point in terms of this question that we're talking about. I won't call it a problem or an issue, because I think it's more of a question of choice and definition. And we have, in probably the last 18 months, we've really defined something within the business which enables us to offer the promotions and marketing and campaign aspect independently of the distribution aspect. And we've done bits of that, in the past, but traditionally with sort of the press and radio team that work in-house, they can sort of obviously do that, for anyone to some extent. And
that's the sort of thing that people were used to paying.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a concept that people really get. But hiring an agency to do that, combined with social digital marketing, combined with overall kind of campaign lead and management, is trying to bundle that together in a way that makes sense. Is something that, because we understand the budgeting and distribution of a record, we kind of can enter that space in quite a sympathetic place. And I think we've realized that we can actually probably help some of these bigger distribution companies and bigger players and being part of a team that works with them, right. Because they do have different resources than we have, and different levels of reach internationally, and more infrastructure and so on and so on. So sometimes the combination of multiple players in a team can be the right thing. So actually the company that you used to work for, we've been doing a couple of campaigns with just on that level, and it's worked really well. I think for both. So it's evolving all the time, and I think one of the great things of being small as a business is that you can be nimble. So from being a management company to being a sort of marketing agency, it's an interesting journey, I think, in the space of what I come back to as this sort of artist business.
All of that was making me think about something we talked about when we had our pre-conversation. So communication is one of the can be a problem. Should we just say that? And I think sometimes that's the attraction of a major record company, because you're going to one spot. If you're a manager, there's one person you call. Right? You're either dealing with your A&R person or you're dealing with your product manager, and they will help navigate everything else that's going on. On the DIY space, you talked about typically not handing over a check for a manager to go off and then piece together their radio pluggers and their PR people and all the rest of it. So, and you have a lot of internal resources that you've built up. What is the right mix, or is there no one right mix to in-house versus disparate collection of people?
I don't think there's a formula for it. I think I think one of the guiding lights has to be your commercial objective. If you think of kind of any other business apart from the music industry, you normally just think, okay, how much do we want to spend on marketing to sell our product? And it's quite, it's quite tangible. In the music industry, because if we're developing an artist brand, then we could invest indefinitely into that brand, and it could return value in many different ways, from publishing to live to selling records. So it's a far broader kind of consideration. So I think you have to put a timeline on it, and you have to put kind of clear objectives when you're thinking about what type of team are we going to engage, and are they external partners or are they internal partners? There might be economies of scale doing some of the internal services. Certainly with us, that's often how we think about it or present it to clients. But they may not be the right people. They may not fit the campaign. They might not get the music. They might not gel with the manager or the artist. And in that case, it doesn't make sense to kind of impose. It won't work. If you work in this business, you've chosen to do it probably not because you want to make your fortune necessarily. You're passionate about music and culture and stuff. So it's a bit counterintuitive to then work on stuff that you don't get or like, especially in the indie space, I think. So I think it's about being realistic. I think that's the winning formula. Be realistic, be objective, focus on your strengths, and it's a marathon, not a sprint as well. Often you see people and you see campaigns that have burnt 80 to 100% of their resources financially on release day. And problem with streaming is that you're definitely not going to have recouped, probably, if that's what you've done, because it's actually about the long tail. Even if you do get global New Music Friday and all the best playlists, still it might take you a minute to earn that back. So you need to be able to keep going. You need to be able to sustain campaigns, and that can be challenging when you're paying expensive monthly retainers to people who are working really hard and have a very high level of expertise and connectivity to deliver things, but ultimately you can't afford to retain them for 2 months, 2 years, whatever it is. So that's where kind of being your own record label becomes a challenge, because you are running a business and you've got to think about what's an appropriate level of marketing budget, and when do I actually want to make a profit, which sadly a lot of people don't think about that until too late.
Well, I guess one of the advantages that larger record companies have always had is that they've been able to fund the new stuff from the old stuff. Right. Music. But and that's a challenge, especially in this world of, well, anyone can be a label. Right. You just sign up to one of these services and off you go. But it isn't quite the same, to exactly the point you just made there. It becomes a challenge. It is a business. It's about risk.
No, I think that's such an important point. You can't go toe for toe with a business that's spent decades acquiring and building a catalog business that can allow it to, and it's fantastic that they can do this, because it means they can invest, take extremely high risk in developing very early talent, and that's so needed. But if that's not for you as an artist, for whatever reason that might be, you want more control, you don't want to go down that space, then you've got to build that baseline catalog and build that revenue stream. So that's why I say it's a marathon, not a sprint. You may get lucky along the way, but it may just take a while. So
and the important thing to do is to pick your team correctly.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for coming on and doing that for me. That
My
was
pleasure.
All
Thanks,
really,
Alex.
really interesting. So to my listeners, thank you for listening. Stay in touch with the show via my socials. I am at Alex Branson on both Twitter and Instagram. And also a shout out to the incredible audio assassins who have provided the music branding for the show. Link in the show notes. Thank you once again.
Thanks.